Steve is going to present us with the international perspective. And then we're going to focus on the Isle of Gaia. Do I pronounce it right? Gaia? Gaia. The island in Scotland. And then Thijs is going to put that in a Dutch perspective. That's what we try to do until lunch. So I give the floor to you, Steve. Do you want this mic or this one?
Oh, is one working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Clare. I've been passionate about community economic development and community enterprise for most of my working life. For over 35 years, I've worked as a practitioner, setting up and running community enterprises. I've worked for a funder, investing in community enterprises, as a campaigner, and I also worked for 10 years with Locality, which in England is I suppose the equivalent to the LSA, with about 550 members, many of the bigger community enterprises, some of them with turnovers of 8 to 10 million euro each year. So really significant organisations. And as I say, I'm obsessed with community enterprise. I think it offers something really special. I think it's part of the future, an important part of the future. Now, I've been asked today to provide some of the big picture, to look at what's happening internationally. Now, if we had a week, I could do that properly. I've got 20 minutes. So I want to focus on what we might call the zeitgeist, about some of the deep changes that I think are happening across the world, which are moving in the direction of encouraging localism, of encouraging an approach of focus on the neighbourhood, and encouraging a community enterprise approach. Are you familiar with this saying? It's an ancient Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Can I just show of hands, how many people think we're living in interesting times at the moment? Yeah. Very interesting times. And that's got two sides. One side of it, I think, is very negative. What we're seeing on around some areas of social, economic, environmental, political, some major challenges happening to our way of life, to how people in Western Europe and elsewhere in the world are living. And I'll mention that in a second. But the converse, which I want to also look at, is the positive side of living in interesting times. I think there's a growing interest, a growing focus on the idea of placemaking, a growing focus on localism, and not just the community sector. Importantly, I've become more and more interested in the big picture. And it's not just communities and neighbourhoods that are understanding the importance of local action. I would argue parts of the private sector, particularly small businesses, and indeed much of the public sector is beginning to move in that same direction. And understanding how those different things connect, I think, is an important challenge for the future. As you know, I come from England. We've had, in the last 50 or 20 years, major changes. I know you're seeing some things similar in this country and in much of all of Western Europe, I suppose. A real challenge to the social compact, the post-war social compact that existed. A fundamental change in the relationship between state and citizen. The idea that the state pulls back at a time of austerity. And make no mistake, that's a political strategy, austerity, not an economic strategy, it's a political strategy. We're seeing across Western Europe a challenge for the state to pull out and re-looking at the relationship between state and citizen, about who does what, about who's responsible for what, about different ways of addressing things that matter to people where they live, work, and have relationships. In England, for a while, this was called big society. Again, people here heard of big society? Yeah. Nobody talks about big society in England. Nobody. Nobody's used that expression for many, many, many years. And it was farcical. It was an attempt to top-down impose what has to be bottom-up. And it has to recognize that every place is different. Some of it, some of the thinking, in a way, was very positive. It was about devolving decision-making, devolving responsibility to communities, so that communities could come up with their own solutions to local problems. But the problem is not all communities are equal. Not all communities have got the same resources, the same capital, the same skills, the same networks, the same social capital. And as a result, what we saw was the poorest neighbourhoods falling even further behind. It was a flawed strategy, a flawed policy. But it did bring the localism agenda into the mainstream, with community rights legislation. And even now, we've ended up, for example, there's a major funder being set up in England, Power to Change, £150 million set aside to encourage and invest in community enterprises. So slowly but surely, the time is coming for community enterprise. And why? The dominant model of the late 19th century and the 20th century has been big. It's been the multinationals, it's been globalization, the big corporation. Has it worked? We've been saturation bombed with messages that tell us that big is good. Big supermarkets give us cheap food, big retailers give us cheap clothing, big banks give us cheap loans, big is best. But there's a downside to all of that, isn't there? Big supermarkets end up closing down, lots of local small businesses. Food's got arguably worse, more processed, less healthy. Big retailers control high streets and shopping centres, and they exclude, often, local producers. And they outsource jobs to countries where human rights are neglected and manufacturing is often carried out in awful conditions. And big banks have encouraged reckless borrowing, even though they've been caught in some of the most shocking corruption of our era. Because they're so big, they've been able to get away with it virtually unpunished. And because these bodies, these big companies, these big corporations are international, they extract money from our communities, our countries, and that money goes to where their stakeholders are elsewhere. So big business, globalization undoubtedly has brought some significant benefits, but the converse, the other side of that, is that a lot of us have actually got a lot poorer. Entire nation states struggle to make ends meet because big businesses really, really don't like paying tax. We've heard big is good, that sometimes people think there's no alternative. But the truth is, monopoly control of public retail spaces, overseas ownership of the economy, a failure to provide market access to the domestic producers, public complicity in tax avoidance, failure to make proper investment, excessive influence of corporate lobbying, and the constant suppression of wages have all been amongst the major factors why inequality in our society continues to rise. Now, I'm not suggesting we should give up the benefits of globalization, nor do I think we need some sort of localism, which is a sort of small-minded, isolationist protection racket. But I would argue we need a better balance, one where market access is not controlled by big corporations, which have got little interest in the economic well-being of communities. Is this just wishful thinking? Does small work? Can small compete against the big corporations? This is a lovely quote from John F. Kennedy, American president who was assassinated in whatever it was, 1964. When written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One is danger, and the other is opportunity. I think that's a great way to look at it. There are lots of dangers. There are lots of threats. There are lots of negatives associated with living in interesting times. But there's also opportunity. There's also the possibility of change. There's a quote here from a woman called Angela Glover Blackwell, who works at PolicyLink, which is a national research body in the USA which focuses on policies affecting low-income communities and communities of colour. As systems fail, individual and community creativity explodes. The people are solving problems themselves. They're coming up with new models and strategies. And within those models and strategies are the kernels of a systemic way forward. And I would argue we're seeing experimentation around the world, which isn't about conventional politics or public policy. It's about building systems for meeting everyday needs. It's practically minded, it's reality-based, it's grassroots, it's do-it-yourself, it's take control of your future, that kind of movement. It's about people who are determined to open up new social and political spaces, physical and virtual, in which people can make up their own rules and negotiate their own governance. How's that reflected? Again, in England, you heard the expression 1,000 flowers blooming? That's been the approach, I think, with community enterprise in England. Except the latest research, last year there were 7,085 community businesses, not 1,000, 7,085 flowers blooming. A 5% growth over the previous year, the fastest growing sector in the English economy, faster than the private sector, small business, big business, anything. Combined income of over £1 billion, 1.2 billion euro. Assets over £2 billion. Employing almost 37,000 people and involving almost 200,000 volunteers. That's a success story. That's something that's growing. But it's not happening in isolation. One of my favourite organisations in the world is BAL, Business Alliance for a Local Living Economy, an American network. This represents over 500,000 small, locally based private sector organisations in the United States. And they focus on local. They focus on localism. They believe that how they do business, how they connect with people, how they connect with the land matters. About how you see the world, about the relationships and the actions you take to strengthen the place that you live in. And they say localism can start with a simple commitment to buy local, keeping your dollars or your euros or your pounds where your heart lives. It means supporting your community to identify, launch and grow the businesses that are needed to serve your community. Taken further, localism encompasses our relationships with the people who grow our food, who offer local goods and services, and invest in local enterprises. In its fullest expression, localism means economic accountability that is held locally and equitably everywhere. That's a message we in the community enterprise movement can absolutely share. It's about placemaking. It's about recognizing local connections are important, economically, socially, politically, and environmentally. I'm pushed for time, so I won't go through this in detail. But around that, you have the core components of the strategy that BAL puts forward. Act local first, prioritize equity, regenerate soil and nature, accelerate collaboration, share ownership, shift capital, co-create policy, cultivate connection. Again, that approach of encouraging 1,000 flowers to bloom, but within an ecosystem, not in isolation, but as part of a bigger picture. I think it's incredible. Private sector businesses taking those same sort of perspectives. What about the public sector? Again, you look around the world, there are lots of examples of local authorities, municipalities, other public sector bodies doing incredibly innovative, exciting stuff. In Italy, Bologna, local authority, is focusing on a commons-based approach, which is incredible. There's some wonderful stuff going on in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Spain, in South America, Canada, USA. But one initiative I wanted to draw your attention to is anchor institutions. Again, something that's really taken off in the United States and is slowly the idea is spreading. Anchor institutions are those big public sector bodies, universities, hospitals, libraries, museums, structures that are attached to a place and have often been there for a long time and they're not moving. But often, some of them, the bigger ones in the past, have lived in an ivory tower almost. There's now a recognition that those bodies can and should play a major part in addressing and being part of local communities. Because with a proper incentive and motivation, they have the potential to leverage their assets and revenues to really make a difference by hiring locally, by supporting local businesses and community enterprises, social enterprises, to become part of their supply chain, to use pension funds to invest. The most famous example of this is the Cleveland model. Cleveland, Ohio, University Circle, a network of major organizations, the Cleveland Clinic, 2 university hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, working together to deploy their resources strategically to address the persistent poverty in 7 surrounding neighborhoods and to improve the prospects and income of 60,000 people who live in those neighborhoods. They have a vision of creating a financially and environmentally sustainable business model that puts workers and communities first. But they're not doing that because of charity. They're doing that because it makes sense for them as businesses. You don't address, for example, you don't address ill health just by building new hospitals. 70% of the factors that are impacting on health aren't related to health care. They're related to poor housing, poor diet, etc., lack of exercise. A hospital, if it takes that wider perspective of improving the health and well-being of the people in its community, is reducing the demand on its services. It makes sense financially. It's that jigsaw coming together. And in Cleveland, one of the key bits, the really exciting bits, is there's not just the big public sector players, there's a key community sector player, Evergreen Cooperatives. When it was first set up, there were 3 companies, a laundry, a solar power installation company, and the largest commercial greenhouse in the USA. And they employ local people, low-income residents. So far, there's about 150, 160 people employed in those 3 businesses. Their goal is 1,000 workers from that particular area. In 2015, the Evergreen Cooperative had revenue of $6.3 million, and it's now working on opening 2 more companies, a creamery, whatever that is, and a bakery. But that's an example of a localist approach of big players, the public sector, using imagination, using its economic power together with communities to create real change where they are. Quickly, because I'm short of time, this has finally crossed the Atlantic. There's a town called Preston in the northwest of England, small town, 140,000 residents. They've created a partnership of the municipality, a police force, a housing corporation, 2 further education colleges. They looked at, between them, what their spend was each year. And it was something like £750 million spent on the goods and services externally, of which 5% was actually spent in the town. And only 39% was spent in the region, which is called Lancashire. And by reviewing their spend, by focusing on what they call progressive procurement, focusing on social value, not just, understanding that best value isn't just about money, it's about social impact as well. By focusing on training, employment, raising living standards, addressing poverty, they've changed the focus of where that money gets spent. And now, only 4 years later, 18.2% of the money goes into the town itself. That's almost £75 million is now going back into the town and being spent within the town and creating jobs and engagement and addressing well-being issues. I'll just end by summarising. As I say, the 20th century, I think, was the century of big business. I think in the 21st century, we're seeing the beginnings of a new paradigm. One of my favourite quotes. Resilient systems and sustainable qualities are 2 elements of an emerging scenario characterised by 4 adjectives: small, local, open, and connected. That's my mantra. Small, local, open, and connected. And utilising small, local, open, and connected can work. It does work. It's shown to be work. Community enterprises understand that. We understand that. Business organisations like BAL in the USA, privately owned businesses, understand that. Small, local, open, and connected is the future. And some public sector institutions, as in the States and in Preston, are beginning to understand that. And these are baby steps forward. They're baby steps forward towards localism, towards a focus on neighbourhood. And the challenge, I think, is to look at the big picture and how we can bring those different things together. No one has the answer. No one sector has the answer. But I think working together, by focusing on place, the potential is enormous. And I'm ending up here. My key message, my last message, there are alternatives. There are plenty of alternatives. I could have given many more examples. We're seeing a desire for change through all sorts of other channels. You've got growing interest in the cooperative movement, social solidarity economy, the degrowth movement, peer production, the sharing economy, collaborative consumption, the commons movement, experimenting around small, local, open, and connected. And I think we all have a role to play, whatever our sector. Indeed, we have a responsibility to drive that change. Each of us, community sector, private sector, public sector. And we know it can be done because it is being done. As Martin Luther King once said, I have a dream, and I think it's time for us to dream, to imagine, and to create. We do live in interesting times, but we can make that a blessing rather than a curse.
Thank you very much for this address to all the people